Let's discuss today Andrea de Capellanus as a literary comedy. The literary comedy of Andreas Capellanus, Michael de Chernis. The earliest recorded information about Andreas Capellanus de Amor indicates that only a century after its composition, it elicited widely divergent responses from its readers, and to this day, criticism has failed to produce a harmonious climate of opinion about the work. In the 13th century, Bishop Stephen Dampier formally condemned it while delighted and amused by it. In our century, it has been read as a serious attempt to codify the sociological phenomena known as courtly love, as a philosophical treatise which may or may not be satirical, as a handbook of practical advice of amorous courtiers, as an ironic attempt upon the sins of flesh, and as a clever, distasteful piece of Manichean anti-feminism. Moreover, in recent years, the foundations of hitherto accepted views of its intellectual and social milieu, its audience and its authors have begun to crumble, making it no longer feasible to treat the De Amor as a reliable historical or sociological source book. At least not until one has satisfactorily determined its purpose, accounted for the ideas and attitudes it expresses, and placed it in literary historical context. In approaching the De Amor objectively, one must confront the twofold problem of its subject and its ideological consistency. Its ostensible subject is Amor, but it is not entirely clear what sort of Amor Andreas has in mind, or whether his views are internally consistent. Reading based upon the premiere that Andreas' subject is courtly love, which he seems to anatomize sympathetically in the book 1 and 2, then to reject in book 3, have had to attempt to explain away the apparent ideological inconsistency of the work as a whole. The important alternative reading of D.W. Robertson Jr., who argues that the subject of the Amor is the sin of cupiditas, achieves ideological consistency only by sacrificing aesthetic consistency. Book 1 and 2 in Robertson view must be read as primarily but not ironic sophisticated comedy masking a condemnation of lust, while book 3 must be read literally as a serious, straightforward diatribe from the same moral position. The reader would thus have to share with Andreas a rigid, preconceived set of attitude towards secular amour, and would have to read every statement in the work in such a way that it would conform to these attitudes. Robertson attempts to reconcile the view of amour in the work seems scarcely more satisfactory than those of scholars of the courtly love persuasion, or that for that matter than the lame excuse offers the book 1 and 2 by Andreas himself. Some years ago, in a view of scholarship or courtly love, Theodore Silverstein pointed out that the concentration upon the intellectual background of any given work ought to be subordinate to question about the work itself. His closing remark deserves repeating here. A healthy literary study of the production of the courtly poet and romance may someday be written, when it will not confuse interpretations with the vagaries of the personal reading, nor will it assume that criticism is confined to historical or spiritual exegesis. It would proceed with an analysis of each piece, whether lyric, dialogue, narrative, and expository treatise, as a separate productive act, and will study the mean by which each writer sought to achieve an intended effect with an audience that was foreseen. In such a work, history will not be abandoned. On the contrary, the position, historical method, philological or otherwise, will be used to explain as precisely as possible the presence in the particular work of particular ideas, themes, doctrine, metaphors, and turns of phrase. This seems an unexceptionable statement of general critical principle. In the particular case of De Amor, what is needed in an analysis which offers the consistent view of the whole work, one which agrees with what we know of the historical, ideological, and literary climate in which it was written, and does not distort the tone or spirit of a text in order to make it fit any preconceived ideas of what a medieval book called De Amor ought to be about. The contempt must be accounted for in a way which is consistent in with the internal to the interpretation of the whole. I hope here to present such a reading. It is my contention that De Amor was written as a comic mock treatise, a pastiche of elements with Andreas found, or though he found, not in lives of the contemporaries, but in the various kinds of literature in vogue in late 12th century. Andreas manipulate these elements and often grossly distort them for comic effect. The object of his humor is not primarily fornicatio or a system of courtly love or the female sex, but literary amour is convention. And Robertson, the subject of the Amor, Andreas claimed to have acceded to the Walter request for instruction in the art of love out of affection for him or out of desire to avoid the charges of dullness at Treditas. Moreover, now that Walter knows how to love and can abstain and thus God's approval, this explanation has not satisfied most critics. The apparent throughout copiousness and pleasure which Andreas devoted to his subject in the book 1 book 2, the pious motives offers the book 3 highly suspect. Furthermore, the fact that he apparently takes equal pleasure in demolishing what he has so carefully built created a certain aesthetic discomfort with the work as an organic whole. Andreas, Plato, and Arabs remark on some recent accounts of courtly love, modern philology, commonplaces. His raw materials come from diverse kind of literature, from work related to one another most obviously in that they all treat in some way the amorphous subject of amour. These materials are not the contempt of any pre-existing system of love. They are random conventional ideas and attitude which had any Andreas in time become indigenous to various kind of literature and which he brings together by force in a single encompassing work. And anyone who has investigated courtly love knows that definitions of it vary considerably and that attempt to determine its essential characteristics tend to rely upon literary rather than extra literary evidence, most usually upon troubadour lyrics, Chatin's romance, and Andreas' treatise. Not surprisingly, this system of love turns out to be assemblage of literary phenomena codified on the basis of elements extracted from late medieval literature. Andreas proves useful in his process because he has already done essentially the same thing. He has written 2 of his 3 books of Amour by extracting and amplifying attitude and assumption he found in contemporaneous romance, lyrics, and debate poems. And the difference is that he is considerably less serious than his scholarly hire of 19th and 20th century. And if I am amusing, all 3 books of De Amor form a kind of burlesque of literary commonplace. Then it would be foolish to insist upon discovering it in form a structural logic or ideological consistency. The most diverse attitude towards Amor are grist for the writer's mill. Andreas' method of treating his material is essentially reductive. He takes tendencies which he perceives in one or other kind of contemporaneous literature about Amor and transform them into a bit of dogma. Thus, the occasional adulterous love affair of romance, those of Lancelot or Tristan, for example, suggest to Andreas a pseudo-definitive statement that amorem non possos inter dos egales extendiers vires, attributes to the Countess of Champion and Regula that Causia, this is in French. In order to formulate such dogma, Andreas, of course, must ignore more ordinary situations such as those in Eric and this is a friend. Some of Mary Lace, in which the lovers are husband and wife and marry at end of the story. By the same token, the fact that literary lovers are often jealous and often turn pale in the presence of their ladies becomes Andreas' dogmatic assertion of the universality of jealousy. or painless. Lovers who fail to live up to Andrea's often bizarre percept must simply be ignored, no matter how admirable they may seem into other respect. Thus, in turn, explain why no single literary work or body of the work or the 12th century perfectly exemplify Andreas' version of Amor in all its particulars. Andreas has no single exemplar in mind. Thus, his theory is eclectic, based upon more or less striking elements commonly, but not universally present in many literary works. By extracting these elements from their context, where they may no more than literary convention, and usually exaggerating or distorting them, he draws attention to tendencies which perhaps would otherwise go unnoticed. Thus, he reveals the commonplace as absorbed, the adultery of Iseult of Guinea verse, which, after all, by the end of the 12th century had become a historical fact of their stories. The Doni, which the audience knew and accepted, is transformed in an improbable norm of marriage ladies. Marriage ladies. Andreas nowhere explicitly state that his intention is anything but serious, and judgment of his readers necessarily depend upon whether they perceive irony at work behind his statement. But it seems to me that much of what he had his various persona say can scarcely be taken anything but attempt humor. For example, the reference of to Andreas' book and to himself as final authority and Amor's matters. Page number 106, 148, and this book too, page number 7, 283. If they are not the sincere judgment of very pompous or very naive writers, must be ironic. Again, no doubt that the earnest discussion concerning whether a lover should prefer the upper or lower half of his beloved person is an attempt to present and solve serious problem. Andreas is describing the universal sexual voraciousness of nuns. Andreas very likely mean only to amuse his readers. Probably jokes like these around in the De Amor, but whether one finally sees the total work as comedy will depend upon an overall view of the materials for which it is composed, and of the matter in which these materials are treated. The manners in which the Amor is constructed is scarcely that of an altogether serious, carefully composed philosophical treatise, although scholars continue to assume that it indeed the degree of rigorous systematic organizations which one expects from serious medieval treatise is seldom, if ever, apparent. Entertaining, non-discursive section, dialogues, framing tales and doctrines, minor inconsistencies like the omission of one of the promised non-nine dialogues, or the female debaters refers to Steelus in the midst of another. The way in which 5 chapters trail off with remark to the effect, and Andreas could continue but prefer that his student discover something for himself, give the lecture as casual haphazard appearance. Most striking is the chaotic list of regulae at the end of the book, that is page number 310 to 12, where this is genuinely systematic treatise. The placement of list would lead to one to expect an ordinary recapitulation of the points set forth in the preceding pages, but in fact it is an apparently random selection of only some of these points in no particular order. Whatever structure the De Amor has, it is not reflected in this list. Andreas obviously did not bother to go through the first 2 books, picking out main point in order to make it, although he could easily have done so. He apparently did not take a work seriously enough to make it wholly coherent and consistent. His casual approach suggests not a serious philosophical and practical purpose, but rather a desire to amuse his readers. The fact that Andreas purports to be writing an art of love in its self suggests the influence of the self-proclaimed master of the subject. Ovid, but close comparison of the De Amor and the Ars Amatorias and Remedies produced no good evidence that Ovid's influence consists of much more than general idea of treatise on love of some sort and pseudo art of science. Andreas' quotations of the passage from Ovid are commonplace, which he may not have, he may have got at second hand, as are the particular point of doctrine, which can be traced back to the art and remedies. Structural similarities which not bear close scrutiny. The De Amor contains no counterpart to Book 3 of the Art, Constructions of the Women. Andrea's narrative material, dialogue list, and court cases are unlike anything in Avoid poems, and in third book wholly differs in tone and purpose from the Remedia, which is explicitly not a retraction or rejection of love. Ovid is patently comic and barely practical. He wasted no time attempting to glorify and theorize about the sexual desire and seduction on free but scarcely respectable women who are proper subject of his sort of love. One might argue that differences between the De Amor and Ovid poems result from Andreas medievalizing and characterizing his classical models. But since the differences produced appear to outweigh the remaining similarities, and since the purpose of the medievalized work may well have nothing to do with that of the model, this argument does not get us very far on the way towards understanding Andreas. The more immediate and important influence upon Andreas is that of the general contemporaneous popular literature, and the most unmistakable evidence of this influence is Book 1 and 2 consist of direct reference to the characters of romance like Anne Flies, Iseult, and Blanchefleur. And in adaptation of narrative derives from the same material as the contemporaneous and romance to introduce two sets of rules. Virtually all of the doctrine of these two books can be abstracted either directly or implications from the attitude and assumptions inherent in 12th century amatory literature, while much of this same doctrine is in no way Ovidian and cannot be proved to have played the significant role in social life of Andreas' time. To take an obvious example, Andreas appears condone and even demand adulterous love affairs to by formulating the rule of the marriage in no proper excuse for no practicing love. Page number 310. He must have extrapolated his ideas from the selective and bemused reading of the work like the various versions of the Tristan story, and that's how it is written in French. As some of the lyrics of some troubadours. The church certainly condemned adultery, and there is no good historical evidence of assumption that under ordinary circumstances, adultery for the sake of love was viewed as an admirable and popular pastime in polite secular society. The associations of amour and adultery is an literary phenomenon. By the same token, the tendency to sublimate love, to elevate the abstract ideas to the status of the supreme value and treat its practice as a religion is reflected in Andreas' description of the ennobling effect of love, and in its presentation of the God of love and as a dispenser of reward and punishment for the death. This religious love has rooted which go back in Western literature at last as far as Ovid, but it takes its particular characteristics and coloring from the religion of the Middle Ages, appearing in Christian garb in Latin lyrics of the 11th and 12th century, as well as 12th century vernacular literature. Here again, while there is no evidence that real 12th century knights and ladies actually subscribed to the religious worship of the romantic love, such sublimation is implied. For example, Cherition's description of Lancelot and Guinevere and permeates the world of Mary Lays, where it seemed clear enough that romantic love reigns as the supreme value. In all probability, Andreas draws upon literature rather than life of his elevated ideas about love, and as well as highly stylized behavior and superior treatise of characters he described to his ideal lovers. These are the conventions which pervade amatory literature, and wholly irrelevant that some or all of them might be verified by observing real lovers and love affairs. Andreas need never have seen the sort of lover or experienced the sort of love he described. Along with his treatment of love as a religious itself, Andreas attributes to his ideal lover or rather striking combination of Christian piety and illicit sexual desire. God and Christian religion flow easily from the tongues of disputant in the dialogues of Book 1, page number 19 to 219. And Andreas himself asserts that love is weakened by blasphemy, mockery, and church ceremonies and withholding of alms. page number 247, and is brought to an end by apostasy, page number 248. The contradiction inherent in Andreas' demand that the lover be a pious Christian while his sexual desire appear in some of the literary work of his time, where it may at one extreme reflect the profound belief in ultimate unity of secular love and Christianity, or at the other, simple the poet uncomplicated desire to insert a note of an conventional pity into a context where it is not entirely appropriate. Shirtians, Prince, can, that's all, St. Paul in rather dubious context. While Lancelot bestowed Christian mercy on his enemy, stopped during this search of Guinevere to pray, and generally acts like a good Christian despite his illicit affair. In Mary Yonki, the lady demanded and gets proof that her prospective lover believes in God before permitting him to cuckold her husband. Barrow's version of the Christian story is liberally sprinkling from the often incongruous pity of the poet narrators and of his adulterous lover. Finally, Donkey demonstrates that the actor of a code of divine and human love of God and amour characterized much of medieval lyric verse. Andreas' treatment of love acquires with money and easy attainment of one's object, and the love of prostitutes are logical extensions of earlier doctrines easily deduced from literary manifestations of amour. Prostitutes have no place in literature of romantic love, either as models of conduct and courtly ladies as source of solace of sexually deprived lovers. So Andreas forbid commerce with them. That is page number 230, 60, 37. That romance heroines could be bribed is unthinkable. So it follows that virus amour cannot be brought. The license of romance are characterized by mutual fidelity and are slow to reach consummation. So Andreas warns against easily attained female who he says cannot confine themselves to a single lover. And while his presentation of himself at a cleric and theorist and a practitioner of amour would seem to demand a chapter drawn the personal experience on cleric of love. Literary precedents of his topic are abandoned, and amorous proclivities of clerics and students who may become clerics are elaborated in Latin lyrics as early as late 10th century and continue to receive expression through the succeeding centuries in poems, which contribute to the debate between clerics and knights, and in collections like the Carmina Burana. Andreas need never have seen a lecherous priest in order to write about them. Andreas follows his chapter on the clerics as a love with one and love of nuns, whom he warns his pupil in the strongest terms to avoid become both God and civil authorities, and look with great displeasure upon license with them. Avoiding such license is not easy, however, even for an adept lover like Andreas, who claims personal experience in his field of endeavor. Nuns are widely a lecherous lot, ever on the alert of sexual intercourse and difficult to escape from. Surely Andreas' portraits of nun as a nymphomaniac is meant to be funny. No doubt there were real nuns in the 12th century whose view of chastities meant little to them. But Andreas talking about all nuns, and it would be absurd to assume at that point that De Amor is socio-cultural document mirroring the everyday life of its time. The sexual desires and practices of cloistered women and men are common topic of curiosity and coarse and humor in the 12th century as they are today, and sexually real of the fancied and non-West clerics appear frequently in medieval literature. Behind Andreas' lecherous nun stand the sisters in convocation in Latin Council at Remier. The authorices of the 12th century Latin love poems in manuscript known as and their sisters who lament in Latin and vernacular song and rigorous of the convent and lack of virile young man. In Andreas' hand, the sister who long for a lover become a rule rather than the exception in the convent. He draws upon the literary tradition of his predisposition towards his subject, a more for comic effect. A similar motive underlies Andreas' inclusion of chapter on the love of peasants, that is page number 235 to 36. He asserts first that while sexuality is natural to agriculture's service in amoris curia is not, and that consequently they should not be instructed to amorous doctrine. This view is quite in keeping with the convention which preserve a strict class distinction between noble practitioner of uh, amor cordius and villain, separating mere sexual desire from more elevated notions of love. Andreas goes on, however, to the point that this pupil might fall in love and peasant's woman, and if so, he should first flatter her and then embrace her by force, curing her outward inflexibility and modesty by compulsion. This virtual license for rape is difficult to reconcile with Andreas' earlier celebration of the virtuous amour inspires in every man. But as W.T.H. Jackson has observed, the approach Andreas described here corresponds directly to the basic situation portraying in the medieval pastorally. In this lyric Yana, the narrator, the knight in the vernacular version, perhaps a cleric in the Latin, comes upon a peasant girl in rustic setting. Andreas locus opportunes is immediately smitten with desire for her, attempts to win her with flattering words of bribery, and failing in his attempt, resorts to force to overcome what often appear to be only token resistance. Andreas here adapts the anti-courtly and obviously comic stance of his literary model, including his peculiar sort of love in his treatise because it appeared, and successful amour, at least some version of the pastorally, in his attempt to appear exhaustive in his pursuit of literary ideas about love. He shows no reservations concerning the consistency between love in pastorally and various aspects of love it defines elsewhere, and likewise include his in work. Indeed, very inconsistency become a source of humor here. Although the precise relationship are somewhat more complex than those discussed above, certain formal aspects of Andreas' first two books seem also to be driven from the literary model. The amatory dialogue of Book 1, for example, probably owes their inspiration to one or more of the various kinds of literary debate that appear in the 12th century. It is commonplace for literary history that the writing of Andreas' time, whether Latin or vernacular, serious or trivial narrative or lyrics, everywhere exhibits a keen and apparently insatiable taste of debate and dialogue, taste which seems to have been fostered habits of dialectical exposition, prominent in the school of time. In Latin and vernacular verses, most often the subject of debate is some aspect of love. Andreas' dialogues are actually extended debate between fictional ladies and gentlemen on the single question: should the ladies accept the gentlemen as their lovers? These debates are often an example of how ornatum. I mean, this is a different language. None of the Andreas' exemplary persona necessarily voices Andreas' own conviction or even the position presented elsewhere in the Amour. Andreas is demonstrating on ornatum amantis eloquim, which does not prove the lover's probates, but only creates the presumption of it, and with thus win over any lady so wise, prudent that she can be seduced by such a subterfuge. If one consider the pervasive fluency of literary lover in lyrics and narrative, it is easy to see where Andreas found the suggestions of this a most important means of acquiring amour. Given Andreas' overt statement of the nature and purpose of dialogues, there is no reason why he should concern himself with consistency or seriousness. They are elaborate comic exercise in the rhetoric of flattery and persuasion, verbal facility, and in every sort of frivolous medieval debate in is everything. Logic, even consistent characterization frequently are victims of the muse of the clever repartee. The curious discussion of amour pursuit and amour mixture exemplify the purely rhetorical nature of arguments presented in the dialogue. The main in dialogue 8 claim to prefer the practice of amour and a nudge lovers kiss and embrace, but omit the extremo isolation, appropriate only amour mixture. This is obviously a stratagem, and a lady knows as well as he with the ultimate result of such innocent encounter would be a monstrosum, a norm named key indicator for this professionally historical theoretical point. Andreas himself make complete nonsense of this men's argument by pointing out amor purus is the same ad and then okay, the same dialogue further indicate Andreas' formal percept can be readily ignored when seduction is objective. The same dialogue further indicate that it is the art of persuasion in love rather than objective of the lover, which is the butt of Andreas' humor. And that freely alters the circumstances in order to expand the range of arguments is personae. Personae. The main admits to being married, page number 172, but later become a cleric. The lady is turns extremely pious and inexperienced in love. One who has been shooed for her love before, one who has felt amorous herself, a widow, a maiden, or think herself too young for love. Again, a lady with another servant, besides the man talking to her, and so she claims a woman in love. Each of these shifts is in identity occasions a new turn in argument. The situation in it, any case, hypothetical and difficult. Different objections demand different answers. Finally, we have the obvious joke that none of the men presented here, an exemplary practitioner in the art of amatory rhetoric, appears successful in convincing his lady of his probits and consequent worth as a lover. The elaborate rhetoric ultimately fails. The suit is flattery objected, and it is put off by the lady's vague remarks concerning a relationship to the service of amour. One or more of the yarners of the poetic debate probably provide the specific inspiration of these dialogues. Within the large debate between the man and woman, in some of them, one finds evidence of the influence of sophisticated amour was debate in the form of minor debates over the sort of trivial comic questions commonly treated in Jew party, and there is even brief echo of the quarrel between knight and clerics. Attempt seduction through flattery is prominent figure of the vernacular posturally and elements of the class distinction upon Andreas organize these dialogues. Indeed, it would be it would not be at all far-fetched to describe the dialogues as a series of variations on the pastorally, in which the ranks of the participants have become flexible and in which the debate has become much more complex than would be possible in a lyric genre. Moreover, the larger question in all of the dialogue, whether a particular woman should love a particular man, is at least implicit in every lyric and narrative where courtship is an issue. Of course, Andreas distort the basic literary situation. In courtly literature, it is at least assumed that the suitor will prove his probitas by his deeds, while here verbal facilities supposedly all succeed requires. And surely Andreas gives his readers taste of dialects and romantic accusatory surface here. His debates are longer than rhetorically elaborate and often more preposterous than anything even remotely like them. They are wholly conclusive here again. Andreas begin with particular tendency of convention of amatory literature, exaggerating and distorting in until essential absurdity becomes apparent. The very judgment of love, which appears as a sort of interlude in book, that is page numbers 271 to 95, which have at times been treated as historical fact, need not detain us long, since Paul Remy in 1955 pointed out that their literary origin, the existence of 12th century codes of love, has never been verified by historical evidence. Remy shows that they are the Remy shows that they are a legend perpetuated by the misunderstanding of the long succession of writers and based upon literary, not social source. Central to Remy's study of the background of this legend are essentially trivial poetic genre of tension, Jewy party, pro party man. Both consist of verse and debate in which the participants explored this question gallant, and then this is refer the question to an arbiter of the final settlement. The freedom and triviality of the subject matter in this genre complement the strict limitations of formal seriousness imposed by the more artificial chanson, and provides an outlet of the contribution debate. The appear to invite further discussion in the trivialities raised in debate, and apparently addressed to the historical person whose designations as arbitrary Remy delivers it intent homage to literary patrons. Such poems are amusements of elegant society, and questions of they raise are never serious. Might be expected no judgment which finally resolve them have ever been decoded. The close resemblance between Andrea's judgment and the kind of question treated in extant example of tension and Jewy party leaves little doubt that these lyric genres underline the section of D. Amor, which itself contributed significantly to the legend of Code of Love. Andrea's case need not be considered historically genuine. In spite of his attributions of the decisions to historical persons, he presents prominent ladies who patronize the sort of literature whose assumptions he had been mocking in his doctrine. As a genuine belief in these assumptions, his joke then is an expense not only of the doctrine of amatory literature but of the audience as well. He implies a relationship between these ladies and their favorite literary entertainments, which resembles that Don Quixote and Amadis of Gaul centuries later. Moreover, in keeping with his practice of exaggerating tendencies and implications, Andreas here improves upon his literary models by treating the kind of questions they present in jest as if they were serious, practical matters, and by giving final definitive answers to them, answers which the troubadours never offer. Posing and debating problems in love casuistry may well have been diverting, but offering purportedly valid solutions in wholly ridiculous. The comedy resides here in Andrea's applicable of mock laws in pseudo practical situations, many of where are in themselves comical. Andrea's third book, De Reprobation Amoris, that is page number 313 to 61, though it too ostensible deals with the subject of amour, is very different in ideology, structure, and tone from his first two books. This abrupt shift in the attitude cannot be accounted for by looking of Ovid's work on amour and possible literary models. Andrea's third book does not conform in any close formal or thematic way of the remedies amour. Avoid. Ovid, it is true, warns against falling in love, but his Ovid purpose and which he follows throughout the remedies is instruct unfortunate lover in the practical sort of getting rid of an unwanted mistress, even if this must be accomplished by finding a new mistress to displace lingering affection for the old one. Remedies. Line 441 to 62. While Andrea's apparent purpose, which is attempted to achieve by means of an essential theoretical argument, is to convince his pupil to reject love altogether in favor of pious chastity. Andrea's wholly negative attitude towards amour, which he claimed at his prefacio, that is page number 1 to 2, remains underdeveloped until the beginning of the book 3, when it burst forth in the startling manner. This new position directly opposes an apparently positive attitude of the earlier book towards love. It excludes all commerce with all women and admits of no compromise. In book 1, he speaks of love conferring virtue at page number 10. But here he says that while avoid while Ovid in the Art and Remedies purports to be consistent in his attitude towards love, whatever it is really may be, Andreas maintained no comparable pretensions of to consistency. The literary tradition behind Andreas' third book is clearly medieval anti-feminism, a tradition extending directly back through the Middle Ages of the classical, biblical, and uh, patristic sources. The primary sources of later medieval anti-feminist argument are a juvenile sixth satire, Jerome's Adversus Jovinianum, and various sections of the Old Testament and 12th century produce its share of moralistic work of attacking women and their vices. Drawing upon these old work for their inspiration, but anti-feminist and anti-amatory sentiments are not confined to such formal diatribes. Satire of women and rejection of love may turn up in romance, lyrics, and fabliaux as well. Andreas followed the medieval anti-feminist fashion in a very general way, and consequently it is probably impossible to determine his particular source, if needed he had any. He was doubtless familiar with at least some of the formal anti-feminist treatises available in his time, and he had taken their common attitude as well as their familiar arguments against women as the basis for his third book. From this new point of view, women are seen as evil, and love of women, which he had before treatise enthusiastically through amorous, he must therefore be treatise uncompromisingly a sin. His stance as moralistic opponent of amour is no less literary than his earlier stance as approving teachers of it. The manner in which Andreas developed his argument appeared to be indicative of both the general source of his ideological position and intended effect of that position. He begins with the commonplace notion that God deplores sin, especially the sin of fornication. Amour here is clearly synonym with lust, sexual passion, fornication, and the like, complex and confusing. Definition of amour, which emerged from the elliptic presentation earlier, has been set aside in favor of single, a rigidly orthodox attitude which allows for no variance in terms of circumstances or motive. Throughout the earlier portion of the book 3, Andreas treats a more exclusive and illicit sexual passion, dwelling not only upon its spiritual danger but upon its physical and social degradations as well. Given his limited definitions and the topic, a more medieval audience could scarcely take issues with his general attitude towards. His position is an orthodox and commonplace as any 12th century Sunday sermon or illicit sexuality. The tone, however, grows steadily more and more negative as the arguments are piled upon one another. He finally manages to attribute virtually everything unpleasant in his life and next to fleshly desire, and even goes far away to present his opposition. Corporeus pudicitia, oh, that's not English, attack upon amour eventually lead to the subject of women, and from this point almost to the end of the book, amour is all but forgotten in eruption of the anti-feminist invective. The pattern to which Andreas confirmed is not that of the Jerome, but in Andreas Adversus Jovi Nienum begins and remains within the bounds of Christian charity by defending the virtue of chastity and virginity rather than attacking the universal nature of women, but that of the juvenile of the treatise of the Theophrastus quoted by Jerome, and number of 12th century poems and treatises whose ostensible subject matter is summarized by the title of one them de conigu non de Seda. These works begin with the questions of whether a man should marry, which they answer negatively. As the author wants to subject their argument in inevitable turn to subject of women. As early as juvenile satire, the initial point of discussion tend to disappear under the profusion and argument against the female sex, leading to one subject, and often the question of marriage is a mere pretext for a venting of the satirist's spleen. And in case of the Walter map, Andrea's initial subject is amour rather than marriage. But nonetheless, the pattern of Book 3 follows that of the various tracts against marriage, which begin as an attempt to discussion from a particular course of action in which women are involved, developed into an unbridled attack upon the female sex. Andreas, I think, is consciously attempted to call attention to the tendency of anti-feminist writing, a rejection of the marriage or the carnality does not logically or doctrinally necessitates a rejection of the every thing even remote associated with women. For a medieval reader, it would appear reasonable that love of God should promote chastity, but it would not. I think follow that this same spiritual love should in turn promote hatred of all women. And Andreas, following most of his anti-feminist predecessors, condemned all women, past and present. In this early book, Andreas employs illogical argument for coming effect and manipulates literary attributes to underscore their absurdity. It seems highly unlike that he is here seriously condemning absurdities of his anti-feminist predecessors. Andreas' treatise tirades against amour goes on far too long and paints far too black a picture of amour consequences to be taken entirely seriously. And it is specifically difficult to take it serious when it follows immediately upon the casual jocularity of their first two books of the treatise. In the same way, his attack upon the nature of women seems, as Donaldson has noted, to be an attempt to surpass his predecessors in the art of anti-feminist formulation. None of his charges against women is wholly new, but then the Andreas time it would have been nearly impossible to find a new charges and does not include nearly all of the charges traditionally leveled in anti-feminist invective. And while Andreas may not have succeeded in surpassing, say, Juvenal in the sheer savage of his attack because Andreas had not necessarily verbal gift of satire, he has succeeded in maintaining a tone at least and vitriolic as that of the 12th century cohorts, while at the same time preserving the semblance of the order and coherent appreciate to a formal treatise. Andrea's denunciation of amour and women is more comprehensive and more uniformly vitriolic than that of the anti-feminist writers between Juvenal and his own time. And I would suggest that that he is following here the same approach through selection and exaggeration to familiar literary material that employs in first two books. His mock anatomy of the glorious chivalric love of amatory literature is meshed by mock anatomy of the reprehensible lustful love of anti-amatory literature. If the author upon which he draws for material of his third book do not mean precisely the same thing, then by word amour that the author he used earlier meant, or even if they do mean the same thing, It simply does not matter to him. Andrea's elaborate literary job does not depend upon a precise distinction between the various kinds of amour in medieval literature. If one read all three of the books of the Amour in the same way as inflicted overdone, essentially comic treatments of the literary materials which Andreas found ready to his hand, its thematic and aesthetic coherence become apparent. Its subject throughout is Amour, but by following the word all of the flexibility and ambiguity which is possessed in contemporaneous amatory and anti-amatory literature. Andreas can ridicule not lovers or haters of the women, but literary tendencies he found amusing. He yokes together for essential contradictions of literary attitude, one romantic and favorable to women, another anti-romantic and anti-feminist, which appear frequently in his time but not ordinarily within the confines of single work, where they tend to undercut the author's credibility. Andreas has perceived these attitudes, whether correctly and fairly, is of little consequence, recognized their implications should they be taken serious, exaggerated them their usual context, and presented them in their most extreme exaggerated form, as if they were part of the coherent philosophical system. If his presentation of the anti-amatory, anti-feminist attitude of Book 3 appears somewhat less overstated, less or travesty of literary commonplaces than his earlier celebrations of romantic love, I would suggest that this impression results from the fact that the anti-amatory moralistic attitude of customarily coached in extreme terms, and consequently Andrea's parody of it must be less immediately, or especially to readers who anticipated finding sober morality in all